Recently, Daystar made the decision to terminate my son Jonathan Lamb's employment. He was not named the future president of Daystar.
Jonathan Lamb has reportedly taken a shocking stand against Joni Lamb during a live broadcast, igniting renewed attention on the long-running conflict within the Daystar family. What began years ago as internal disputes has now unfolded publicly, pulling in allegations dating back to 2020, involving serious accusations and leadership struggles. As tensions escalate between mother, son, and the broader ministry, viewers are left questioning how this once united family reached such a breaking point and what comes next, a family empire under fire. For decades, the name Lamb carried weight in Christian broadcasting, associated with influence, ministry, and global reach. But behind the polished image of faith and television success, a deeply complicated family story was quietly unfolding. And today, that private tension has erupted into a very public divide involving Joni Lamb, her son Jonathan Lamb, and the legacy built alongside her late husband, Marcus Lamb. To understand how things reached this breaking point, we have to go back to the origins of the empire itself. In 1997, Joni and Marcus Lamb launched Daystar television network with a clear mission: to spread Christian teachings through media and create a global platform for faith-based programming. What started as a shared vision between husband and wife eventually grew into one of the most recognized Christian networks in the world. But as the ministry expanded, so did the complexity of the family dynamics behind it. Years later, attention began shifting toward succession within the organization. By 2021, after the passing of Marcus Lamb due to complications related to COVID, questions quickly emerged about who would lead the network forward. Many observers believed the natural successor would be Jonathan Lamb, who had long been involved in the ministry and had served in key leadership roles, including vice president. From a young age, Jonathan had reportedly been deeply involved in both the operational and spiritual direction of the family's work. Those close to the situation described him as someone who had invested years into the ministry, preparing himself for leadership long before any formal transition was discussed. So when the leadership structure changed after Marcus's passing, it sparked quiet but growing tension within the organization. Instead of a clear succession path, leadership shifted in a different direction. Joni Lamb stepped into the role of president shortly after her husband's death, a move that immediately drew attention from both supporters and internal observers. While some viewed it as a stabilizing decision during a fragile moment, others reportedly saw it as the beginning of a deeper internal conflict, one centered on expectations, legacy, and authority within the family-run ministry. As time went on, the situation reportedly became more strained. By 2024, Jonathan Lamb was removed from his position as vice president of Daystar. At first, the reasons behind his termination were unclear, leading to widespread speculation among viewers and supporters of the network. Jonathan later shared his own account, claiming he had been pressured to sign a non-disclosure agreement tied to undisclosed matters. According to his statements, his refusal allegedly led to disciplinary actions and what he described as a gradual push out of leadership responsibilities, including what he characterized as a demotion under performance-related concerns. However, Daystar leadership presented a different explanation. The organization stated that Jonathan's departure was the result of a prolonged performance review process and his failure to meet the requirements outlined in a formal improvement plan. They further maintained that all actions taken were consistent with internal policies and documented procedures. At the center of the dispute was not just employment status, but trust, communication, and control over narrative inside a family-run institution. According to Jonathan, the environment inside the organization had become increasingly restrictive, especially regarding what leadership members were allowed to say publicly or share on social platforms. He described this as a culture where approval was required before speaking on sensitive internal matters. Adding another layer to the conflict was the inclusion of strict guidelines that reportedly limited commentary on leadership decisions, internal changes, and even family-related discussions connected to the ministry. For Jonathan and his supporters, these restrictions raised concerns about transparency and accountability within the organization. But perhaps the most emotionally charged point involved disagreements over personal beliefs within the family itself. Reports suggested that tensions were not only professional, but also deeply personal, involving differences in convictions and relationships that further widened the gap between mother and son. And just as the situation seemed to settle into an internal corporate dispute, it took a far more personal turn, one that would widen the divide even further. Because beyond leadership struggles and policy disagreements, another controversy was quietly developing inside the family circle, one that would soon shift the entire narrative from internal restructuring to deeply personal conflict involving marriage, faith, and loyalty. And what unfolded next would not only test the boundaries of their ministry, but also redefine the public perception of the Lamb family entirely. A new marriage that deepened old wounds. Even as internal tensions within the ministry continued to build, a separate and deeply personal development began unfolding that would further widen the cracks inside the Lamb family. What initially appeared to be a private life decision soon became another point of emotional and ideological conflict, one that carried consequences far beyond marriage itself. At the center of this shift was Joni Lamb, a prominent figure in Christian media who had spent decades shaping public messaging around faith, marriage, and biblical values through the network she co-founded with her late husband, Marcus Lamb. For many years, Joni had been closely associated with teachings emphasizing traditional Christian principles, including strict views on divorce and remarriage. That is why, when news surfaced in 2023 that she had entered into a new marriage, it immediately drew widespread attention, not only from viewers of the network, but also from individuals within her own family circle. She married Dr. Doug Weiss, a well-known Christian counselor who had previously appeared within ministry-related spaces and was already familiar within their broader professional environment. On paper, the relationship appeared to be rooted in shared beliefs, mutual understanding, and long-standing association within Christian circles. However, behind the public framing of unity and faith, the decision reportedly became a sensitive and dividing issue within the family. Concerns began to surface regarding the timing and circumstances surrounding the relationship, particularly because Doug Weiss had previously been married to Lisa Weiss for many years before their separation. The details surrounding that transition, including how quickly events unfolded after his prior marriage ended, became a subject of discussion among observers and supporters of the ministry. While the marriage itself was presented publicly as a personal milestone, internally, it allegedly became a point of disagreement that touched deeper issues: faith interpretation, leadership influence, and boundaries between personal life and organizational identity. For Jonathan Lamb, the situation reportedly carried a heavier weight than a simple difference of opinion. According to accounts circulating around the conflict, his discomfort was not only about the relationship itself, but also about how it intersected with leadership roles and visibility within the ministry structure. As time went on, Doug Weiss's presence within public ministry settings reportedly increased, including appearances and co-hosting roles alongside Joni. That development, according to those familiar with the situation, marked a turning point. What had once been a private matter gradually began blending into the operational and public-facing side of Daystar. This overlap between personal relationships and organizational leadership allegedly intensified concerns among certain family members who felt that boundaries were becoming less defined. The issue was no longer confined to personal disagreement. It was now tied to influence, direction, and the image of the ministry itself. Within this environment, Tensions that had already been building began to take on a more permanent shape. Conversations that might once have remained behind closed doors were now becoming part of a larger, more complicated narrative involving faith, authority, and loyalty. And as the emotional and ideological divide deepened inside the family, an even more serious controversy was already forming in the background, one that would soon push the situation far beyond internal disagreements. Because what followed next would shift the entire story from private conflict and leadership tension into public accusations, legal pressure, and allegations that would draw intense scrutiny from outside the ministry. And once it reached that point, there would be no way to keep it contained. The controversy that put the entire ministry under scrutiny. What began as internal disagreements over leadership and personal convictions eventually escalated into something far more intense, an unfolding public controversy that pulled the entire Lamb family into a storm of allegations, legal threats, and conflicting narratives. At this point, the situation was no longer confined to family conversations or internal ministry decisions. It had become a public dispute, with reputations, credibility, and truth itself being fiercely contested. At the center of this growing controversy were the deeply strained relationships within the family of Joni Lamb, her son Jonathan Lamb, and the broader legacy of the ministry founded by Marcus Lamb. The tension reached a new level when journalist Julie Roys, through the Roys Report, published an article that quickly ignited widespread attention and controversy. The report included serious allegations tied to the family, particularly involving claims connected to Jonathan and Susie's child. The nature of these claims immediately triggered strong reactions from all sides involved, especially within Daystar's leadership. Almost immediately after the article circulated, Daystar's legal team responded with a formal and forceful cease and desist letter. The letter, reportedly 10 pages long, accused the Roys Report of publishing false and damaging statements related to allegations of sexual misconduct involving a minor family member. The legal correspondence was sent through attorney Michael D. Anderson, representing Daystar Television Network. It was issued via the law firm Kelly Hart and demanded that the publication retract or correct what it described as inaccurate reporting. The deadline attached to the demand added urgency, with the implication that failure to comply could lead to legal action. According to the letter, the statements published were not only false, but also part of what Daystar described as a coordinated effort to damage the organization's reputation. The letter further alleged that Jonathan and Susie Lamb, both formerly associated with the network, were central figures behind what Daystar characterized as a smear campaign against the ministry leadership. In strong language, the letter asserted that the reporting lacked factual basis and relied on unverified claims. It also emphasized that the organization believed it had been unfairly targeted through repeated publication of allegations it deemed defamatory. The tone of the document reflected just how serious and escalating the situation had become behind the scenes. However, the response from the Roys Report was equally firm. Their legal representative, Christine Jones, rejected the accusations made by Daystar and defended the integrity of their reporting. She stated that the publication had acted responsibly and had even reached out to Daystar prior to publication, offering them the opportunity to respond. According to their position, the reporting was based on interviews, documentation, and investigative work that supported the claims being presented. They maintained that the allegations raised serious questions that required public attention and could not be dismissed without proper examination. As the back and forth continued, the dispute quickly evolved into more than just a disagreement over journalism. It became a broader conflict over credibility, accountability, and who holds authority over the narrative being presented to the public. In a separate discussion with the Christian Post, journalist Julie Roys further elaborated on her concerns regarding Joni Lamb's public statements addressing the allegations. While Joni, as president of Daystar, had addressed parts of the controversy in a video discussion, Julie expressed skepticism about the completeness of those responses. She pointed out what she believed were inconsistencies and unanswered questions surrounding the incident. Among her concerns were details about meetings, timelines, and internal responses to the initial report of alleged misconduct. According to her, there were still significant gaps in the public explanation that had not been fully addressed. Julie also raised questions about why certain interactions allegedly took place behind closed doors, and why some individuals involved reportedly had limited opportunity to speak openly about their experiences. These questions added another layer of complexity to an already highly sensitive situation. At the same time, Daystar leadership continued to deny any wrongdoing. Joni Lamb publicly rejected the allegations, describing them as false and part of a broader attempt to discredit both her and the ministry. She maintained that the narrative being circulated did not reflect the true sequence of events. In her public remarks, she referenced an earlier incident involving her granddaughter, stating that the situation was misunderstood and misrepresented in public discussions. She insisted that what had been portrayed as a cover-up or internal suppression of information was, in her view, a mischaracterization of events that had been handled appropriately at the time. However, Jonathan and Susie Lamb presented a very different account of what transpired. Now separated from Daystar's leadership structure, they alleged that a serious incident involving their daughter had been reported internally before Marcus Lamb's passing. According to their version of events, concerns were raised about a family member identified only as Pete. The allegations described a disturbing encounter that reportedly occurred at a family gathering, where the child allegedly experienced inappropriate behavior. Jonathan described a moment of shock upon discovering the situation, recounting emotional details of what he claims happened when he confronted the individual involved. Following the incident, the family reportedly contacted authorities. The case initially stalled due to limitations in the child's ability to provide detailed testimony. It was later reopened and, according to reports, remained under review by the Colleyville Police Department in Texas. Meanwhile, the accused individual's legal representative has denied all allegations and maintained his client's innocence. As these conflicting accounts emerged, the situation became increasingly difficult for the public to interpret. Each side presented strongly opposing narratives, with both insisting they were acting in defense of truth and integrity. The controversy intensified when Jonathan and Susie, after leaving Daystar leadership, claimed they were being harassed and surveilled, saying they went into hiding for safety. Their statements added urgency and fear, turning a leadership dispute into a wider public conflict, involving legal tensions, journalism, family separation, and personal allegations. And yet, despite all the public statements, legal responses, and media coverage, one thing remained clear: the situation was far from resolved. In fact, behind the legal letters and public interviews, another response from Daystar leadership was already emerging. One that would directly challenge the narrative being pushed by Jonathan and Susie and further intensify the dispute. Because what came next would not only deepen the divide within the family, but also reshape how the public viewed the entire conflict moving forward, setting the stage for an even more confrontational and emotionally charged chapter in the story: the final collapse of private boundaries. By this point, the conflict had completely outgrown the walls of family discussion or internal ministry concerns. What remained was a fully exposed public dispute, one driven by opposing statements, legal pressure, and a fractured relationship that no longer resembled the unity the Lamb family was once known for. At the center of the ongoing tension was Joni Lamb, who continued to stand firmly by her public defense of both her leadership and her personal decisions. On the other side was her son, Jonathan Lamb, who, along with his wife, had already stepped away from the ministry and was now openly challenging the narrative being presented by Daystar leadership. The disagreement escalated further when Joni publicly addressed the allegations during an episode of Joni Table Talk. In her remarks, she strongly denied any claims suggesting wrongdoing or cover-up involving her granddaughter. She insisted that the accusations circulating online were false and deeply misrepresentative of what actually occurred. According to her explanation, the incident being referenced had been misunderstood from the beginning and was tied to a situation at a preschool rather than what had been portrayed in public discussions. She maintained that there was no concealment, no cover-up, and no deliberate attempt to hide information from authorities or family members. But despite her firm denial, the response did little to calm the situation. Instead, it seemed to widen the divide even further. Supporters of Jonathan and Susie continued to point to unanswered questions and conflicting details, while supporters of Joni viewed the claims as a coordinated attempt to damage both her reputation and the ministry she built with her late husband, Marcus Lamb. As both sides doubled down, the situation took on a more permanent and public dimension. What was once a private family disagreement had now become a global talking point, closely followed by audiences who had once known the family primarily through faith-based broadcasting rather than controversy. The emotional weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about leadership roles or differing beliefs. It had evolved into a deeply personal and painful breakdown of trust between mother and son, amplified by public statements and media attention. Every new comment or response seemed to reinforce the divide rather than repair it. Instead of moving toward resolution, both sides appeared more determined to defend their positions, even as the gap between them continued to grow. And perhaps what made the situation most striking was how completely the boundary between private family life and public ministry had disappeared. Every disagreement was now broadcast, analyzed, and debated in full view of the public. At this stage, reconciliation no longer felt like a matter of clarification or misunderstanding. The conflict had hardened into something far more complex, rooted in belief, loyalty, and deeply personal convictions that neither side seemed willing to compromise on. And with that, the situation reached a clear breaking point. A point where silence was no longer an option, where neutrality was impossible, and where every statement only deepened the divide further. Because at this stage, one thing had become undeniable. This was no longer just a disagreement inside a family. It was a full-scale collapse of trust, legacy, and unity, playing out in real time, with no clear way back. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more updates and stories like this. See you in the next video.